Hello everyone, my name is Mohammed Abu Shaib and I'm a student at Yarmouk University and I'm going to present chapter 9 from Jeremy Munday's Introducing Translation Studies. This chapter is titled The Role of Translator, Visibility, Ethics, and Sociology, and it marks a significant shift in the focus of translation studies. Up until this point in the book, previous chapters dealt with linguistic theories, equivalence, cultural studies, and descriptive approaches. Chapter 9 turns the spotlight directly onto the translator as a person, their position in society, the ethical choices they make, and the social and institutional forces that surround and constrain them. The chapter is authored by Jeremy Munday, one of the leading scholars in translation studies, and it draws on a rich tradition of critical, sociological, and philosophical thinking about what it means to translate and who gets to do it, and under what conditions. The three keywords in the title tell us everything about the chapter's scope. The first keyword is visibility, or rather the lack of it. Translators are often invisible. Their names don't appear on covers. Their decisions aren't discussed. And their translations are read as if they were original text. The second keyword is ethics, the moral and the political choices involved in how to translate. Do you make the text feel local and comfortable, or do you preserve its foreignness and strangeness? Third keyword is sociology, the broader social world in which translation happens. The publishers, editors, literary agents, reviewers, and power structures that shape what gets translated, how and by whom. This slide gives us a bird's eye view of everything that will be covered in the chapter. It's worth going through each concept carefully here, because they all connect to one another. Translators' invisibility. The first and most central concept belongs to Lawrence Venuti, an American translation theorist and practicing translator. His idea of invisibility refers to the way translators in Anglo-American culture are systematically erased, not just symbolically, but practically. Their names disappear from book covers. Their work is never discussed in review, and the translations themselves are expected to read so smoothly that no one ever thinks about the translator at all. Venuti sees this not as an innocent practice, but as a form of cultural and economic repression. Foreignizing versus domesticating. Building on his critique of invisibility, Venuti proposes two opposing translation strategies. Domesticating translation makes a foreign text feel at home in the target language. It flows naturally, reads easily, and erases traces of the original. Foreignizing translation, by contrast, deliberately preserves elements of the source cultural strangeness. It resists the smoothing over and makes the reader aware that they are reading something originally written in another language, from another culture. Venuti clearly advocates for foreignizing translation as a form of ethical and political resistance. Berman's negative analytic. Antoine Berman, a French translation theorist, arrived at similar conclusions through a different route. He identified 12 specific deforming tendencies in literary translation, systematic patterns through which translators often unconsciously flatten, simplify, or domesticate the original text. He called this analysis the negative analytic, a kind of diagnostic tool that reveals how and why translations tend to erase the foreign voice. Berman's counter-proposal was what he called literal translation, not word for word, but deeply attentive to the letter, texture, and linguistic richness of the original. Sociology of Translation. In the latter half of the chapter, attention shifts to the sociological context of translation, drawing heavily on the work of a French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. Scholars have applied concepts like field, habitus, capital, and elogio to explain why translators make the choices they do, and why they often have very little freedom in making those choices at all. Power network. Translation does not happen in a vacuum. There is an entire industry surrounding it. Publishers, editors, literary agents, marketing departments, and reviewers, each of whom exercises power over the translation process. Venuti and others have shown that this power network overwhelmingly favors domesticating fluent translations and works against translator visibility and autonomy. Reception and paratexts. Finally, the chapter looks at how translations are received, how they are reviewed, packaged, marketed, and read. The concept of paratext from the theorist Gerard Genette refers to all the textual elements that surround a book: titles, covers, blurbs, reviews, prefaces, and how these elements shape and even distort the reception of the translated work. In this slide, we have the cultural and political agenda of translation. Let's start with Venuti versus Tory. This section sets up the broader argument of the chapter by positioning Venuti in relation to an earlier approach. In Chapter 7 of the book, Munday discussed Gideon Teray's descriptive translation studies, a scientific, empirical approach that aimed to produce value-free norms and laws governing how translations behave. Tory wanted translation studies to be an objective, neutral discipline. This is a fundamental disagreement. Tory sees translation studies as a descriptive science. Venuti sees it as a critical, politically engaged discipline. Who controls translation? Venuti draws our attention to the full network of agents involved in producing and circulating a translation. These include publishers and editors. They decide which foreign texts are worth translating. They commission a translator, they pay them often very little, and they frequently dictate the translation method. They have the most power in the system. Literary agents. They act as intermediaries between author and publisher, filtering which foreign work reach the attention of target culture. Publishers. Marketing and sales teams. Their priorities are commercial and they tend to favor texts that are easily packaged for a domestic audience. Reviewers. They write about translations in newspapers and literary journals, and their comments shape how translations are received and read. As we will see, they rarely give the translator much credit. Each of these players has their own ideological position, their own commercial or cultural interests, and their own power within the system. The translator's dilemma. The translator sits within this network as one of its least powerful members. They are embedded in the dominant culture, shaped by its values, trained in its norms, and constrained by the contracts they sign and the instructions they receive. Venuti argues that translators can either accept the dominant culture's values or rebel against them. But rebelling, as we will see, comes at a cost. In this slide, I will talking about the translator's invisibility. This is one of the most famous concepts in all of translation studies, and it comes from Venuti's 1995 book, The Translator's Invisibility, A History of Translation. Venuti draws on his own experience as a translator of experimental Italian poetry and fiction to describe a paradox. The better a translator does their job in the conventional sense, the more invisible they become. Invisibility in Venuti's definition refers to the translator's situation and activity in contemporary British and American culture. The two causes of invisibility. Cause number one, the translator's own practice. Translators themselves tend to translate fluently into English. This means producing a text that reads naturally, idiomatically, and smoothly in the target language. The result is what Venuti calls an illusion of transparency. The translation appears as if it were simply a window onto the original, as if no mediation had taken place. The translator's choices, decisions, cultural negotiation, and creative labor. Smooth surface. Cause number two, the target culture's expectations. Readers, publishers, and reviewers in Anglo-American culture have been conditioned to expect translations to feel like originals. A translated text, whether prose or poetry, fiction or non-fiction, is judged acceptable when it reads fluently, when it seems to reflect the foreign writer's personality or intention directly, when it appears not to be a translation at all. The standard is if you can tell it is a translation, something has gone wrong. This creates a deeply problematic situation. The translation that is most praised is the one where the translator has most completely erased themselves. The translator's success is measured by their disappearance. We can ask a question here. Why does this matter? Venuti connects this invisibility to the prevailing conception of authorship. In Western literary culture, the author is seen as the original creative genius. Translation is seen as derivative and secondary. English language translation practice. Venuti argues, tracing this back to Dryden in 17th century, has always sought to conceal the act of translation. So much so that even today, translations are rarely considered a form of literary scholarship. This has real consequences. Translators are paid poorly, rarely received royalties, often don't get their names on book covers, and are almost never discussed seriously in literary reviews. Slide 5 is talking about domestication versus foreignization. This is Venuti's most practically influential theoretical contribution. The distinction between domestication and foreignization as two fundamental translation strategies. Let's talk about the roots of this distinction. Venuti traces these two approaches back to the German philosopher and theologian Friedrich Schleiermacher, who in his 1813 essay, Über die verschiedenen Methoden der Übersetzens, on the different methods of translating, described two and only two real options for translator. First option is leave the reader in peace as much as possible and move the author toward him. This is domestication. Second option is leave the writer in peace as much as possible and move the reader toward the writer. This is foreignization. Venuti takes this old distinction and gives it a new politically charged dimensions. Let's move to the domestication concept. Domesticating translation involves translating in a transparent, fluent, invisible style that minimizes the foreignness of the target text. It means selecting and adapting texts so they fit smoothly into the target culture's expectations, values, and literary canons. The foreign text is effectively assimilated into the receiving culture. Its strangeness is erased. Its cultural otherness is neutralized. Venuti describes this as an ethnocentric reduction of the foreign text to receiving cultural values. It is, in his view, a form of cultural violence, however well-intentioned, because it denies the foreign text its own identity and imposes the target cultural norms upon it. Domestication dominates British and American translation culture. Publishers favor domesticated translation because they sell better. Readers expect them because that's what they're used to. Reviewers praise them as natural and readable. The second concept is foreignization. Foreignizing translation, by contrast, is deliberately resists this smoothing process. It chooses texts that are excluded by dominant cultural values and develops translation methods that highlight the cultural and linguistic difference of the original. The translation is intentionally non-fluent. It may use unfamiliar syntax, retain foreign words or names, preserve cultural references that a domestic reader might not immediately understand, or use archaic or experimental language. Venuti sees Veronizing translation as a highly desirable strategic cultural intervention, a way of making the receiving culture aware of what lies beyond its own borders, of challenging its assumption and expanding its range. The goal is to send the reader abroad rather than bringing the foreign text home. Venuti himself practiced this in his translation of the 19th century Italian novelist Eugenio Ugo Tarquati. He deliberately included modern American slang, archaic construction, and close adherence to Italian sentence structure to make the translation feel foreign and to make his own presence as translator visible. Importantly, and this is a point often missed, domestication and foreignization are not binary opposites. They exist on a continuum, and all translations involve elements of both. Moreover, they are ethically motivated choices rather than purely technical ones. They reflect the translator's attitude toward the foreign text and culture. Venuti also acknowledges contradictions in his own position. Foreignizing translation is still ultimately a domestication of sorts, because it translates the source text for a receiving culture, and what counts as foreign depends on the norms of the receiving culture. Foreignization only becomes visible when it departs from those norms. Slide number 6. Berman's negative analytic. Antoine Berman, 1942 to 1991, was a French translation theorist who arrived at conclusions similar to Venuti's but through a different intellectual tradition, rooted more in philosophy and phenomenology than in cultural politics. His key work is L'épreuve de l'étranger, 1984, translated into English as The Experience of the Foreign, 1992, and the seminal article Translation and the Trials of the Foreign, 1985/2012. The concept of épreuve for Berman translation is an épreuve, a French word that means both experience and trial or ordeal. This double meaning is important. First, it's an experience of strangeness for the target culture. Encountering the foreign text is an encounter with something genuinely other. Second, it's a trial for the foreign text itself. Begin uprooted from its original linguistic context. It's put through an ordeal. Berman argues that translation should allow this strangeness to come through. The foreign should remain foreign. The ethical aim of a translation is receiving the foreign as foreign. The negative analytic. However, Berman observes that there is generally a system of textual deformation at work in translations that prevents this from happening. He calls his examination of this system the negative analytic, a diagnostic tool for identifying the forces that deform translations and erase the foreign. He identifies 12 deforming tendencies that operate in literary translation, especially in the translation of novels. First, deforming is rationalization, modifying or rationalization the systematic structures of the original, simplifying complex sentence, altering punctuation and sentence order. Translations of Dostoevsky that remove his characteristic repetitions are a classical example. The second, deforming, is clarification, making explicit what is deliberately ambiguous or implicit in the original. This clarification actually reduces the richness of the text by resolving ambiguities that were intentional. Third, deforming is expansion. Translated texts tend to be longer than originals. This expansion comes from empty explicitation, over translation, and flattening. Additions that actually reduce rather than enhance the clarity and rhythm of the original. Fourth, deforming is ennoblement. Some translators improve on the original by rewriting it in a more elegant or literary style. This destroys the oral rhetoric and the formless, biologic quality of the original. The opposite problem, making the translation too colloquial, is equally destructive. The fifth, deforming, is qualitative impoverishment, replacing words and expressions with target language equivalents that lack the sonic richness of the iconic, sound, symbolic quality of the originals. The word butterfly, for instance, sounds very different in different languages, and those sounds carry meaning. The sixth, deforming, is quantitative impoverishment, loss of lexical variation. If a Spanish text uses 3 different words for face, semblante, rostro, cara, rendering them all as face, lose the variation that gives the original its richness. The seventh, deforming, is destruction of rhythms. Rhythm is important not just in poetry, but in prose too. Deforming word order and punctuation can destroy the rhythmic texture of the original. The eighth, deforming, is destruction of underlying networks of signification. Throughout a text, a network of recurring words and phrases creates coherence and depth. Individually, these words may seem unimportant, but together they form a kind of semantic web. Translation that does not attend to this web loses something essential. The ninth, deforming, is destruction of linguistic patterns, where the source text is systematic in its constructions and patterns. Translations tend to be systematic, using a range of different techniques that standardize and homogenize the target text, destroying the original's specific linguistic patterns. The 10th, deforming, is destruction of vernacular networks or their exoticization. Local speech patterns, dialects, and cultural references are crucial to establishing the setting and authenticity of a novel. If they are erased, something vital is lost. But the solution of exoticizing them, putting foreign words in italics, for example, is also problematic as it isolates the form, the rest of the text, and finding a target language equivalent, like making an Australian farmer speak Bavarian dialect in a German translation, is absurd. The 11th, deforming, is destruction of expressions and idioms, replacing an idiom or proverb with its target language equivalent is, for Berman, an act of ethnocentrism. To play with equivalence is to attack the discourse of the foreign work. The 12th, deforming, is effacement of the superposition of languages. Many literary texts are characterized by the coexistence of different languages, dialects, sociolects, and registers within the same text. Joyce's Finnegan's Wake is an extreme example. So is much Latin American writing in Spanish interspersed with English. Translation tends to erase these multiple linguistic layers, flattening the text into a single register. Berman's positive alternative, literal translation. Counterbalancing this negative analytic is Berman's proposal for a positive analytic, which he calls literal translation. But this is not literal translation in the conventional sense of word-for-word fidelity. Rather, it means being attached to the letter of the original, attending deeply to its specific signifying processes, its rhythms, its textures, its linguistic creativity. Literal translation for Berman actually transforms the target language. It makes the target language richer, stranger, more expensive by allowing the foreign to come through.
Slide number 7. The position and positionality of the translator. This section examines not just what translators do, but who they are, their stance, their ideology, their place of enunciation, and how all of this shapes their translations. Translator comments, useful but biased, to reward that explicit comments from participants in the translation process should be treated with caution. They may be self-justifying or idealized, but more recent work in translation studies has found great value in what translators say about their own work. At best, their comments reveal their actual working practices. At worst, they reveal what they think they ought to be doing, which is equally informative. Several prominent translators of Latin American fiction talk about their work in terms of ear, voice, and flow, vague, intuitive concepts. Gregory Libasa discusses the balance between accuracy and flow. Margaret Sayers Peden talks about listening to the voice of the source text. John Philistiner even listened to Neruda reading his own poems. Edith Grossman writes about hearing in the most profound way I can that text in Spanish. These descriptions, however poetic, reveal a dominant paradigm that prioritizes naturalness, fluency, and a kind of mystical identification with the author. This is, in Venuti's terms, deeply domesticating. Ideology sits in the translator's voice. Maria Timaxo, a significant theorist in this area, challenges the idea that the translator is a natural mediator. She argues the ideology is not just in the text being translated, but in the voicing and stance of the translator themselves, their place of enunciation, which is ideological as much as geographical or temporal, their relationship to the receiving audience. Timaxo rejects the romantic and elitist Western notion of the individual, uncommitted translator working alone. She argues for translators to understand themselves as ethical agents of social change, engaged in collective action rather than isolated craft. The translator as intervenient being. Carol Meyer develops this further with the concept of intervenence. The translator as an intervenient being, someone who deliberately and consciously intervenes in the text and in culture. This is not a natural act, but an ethical and political one. The activist turn in translation studies. Wolf 2012 sees translators engaging in community interpreting, advocacy, volunteer translation of humanitarian organizations, and other forms of socially engaged work that go far beyond simply producing a target text.
Slide 8. The Sociology of Translation. Since the turn of the millennium, the sociology of translation has become one of the most active and productive areas of the field. Scholars have asked what social forces shape the translator's choices. What is the translator's position in the social field of literary production? How do power, prestige, economic interest, and social capital determine what gets translated and how? The dominant theoretical framework for answering these questions has been borrowed from the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, 1930 to 2002. Bourdieu's key concepts. Field. A field is a structured social space. In Bourdieu's terms, a set of struggle between competing agents. For translation studies, the relevant field includes all the participants in translation process: author, commissioners, publishers, editors, translators, and readers. Each of them occupies a different position with the field, and they compete for dominance, prestige, and resources. Habitus. The habitus is, roughly speaking, the deep, largely unconscious set of dispositions, tastes, values, and tendencies that shape how an individual perceives and acts in the world. It is formed through upbringing, education, social class, and professional training. For translators, the habitus includes their internalized norms about what good translation looks like, what is acceptable, what risks are worth taking. Daniel Simeoni applied the concept of habitus directly to translators in his 1998 article, The Pivotal Status of the Translator's Habitus. He found that translation is a poorly structured activity where most translators have negligible control over their work, and that the translational habitus is generally one of voluntary servitude. Translators tend to internalize and accept the constraints placed upon them rather than resist them. Capital. Bourdieu identifies several forms of capital: economic capital, money and material assets; social capital, networks of contacts and relationships; cultural capital, education, knowledge, intellectual prestige; symbolic capital, reputation, status, recognition. Translators tend to have relatively little of any of these, especially economic and symbolic capital. Publishers and editors hold for more. Elogio. Elogio refers to the limits of awareness within the field, the unquestioned assumptions and rules that participants in a field take for granted without realizing they are doing so. For translators, this might mean simply assuming that translation should be fluent and readable without ever questioning why. Bourdieu is not the only framework applied to translation sociology. Scholars have also drawn on Bruno Latour's actor network theory, which analyzes how networks of human and non-human agents interact in the translation process. Nicholas Lemon's social system theory, which views society as a complex of closed functional systems operating beyond the immediate influence of individuals. Slide 9 is the power network of the translation industry. This section takes a closer, more concrete look at the real-world power dynamics of the translation industry. Who control what, who benefits, and who suffers. The translator's weak position. Venuti has documented extensively how the literary translator typically works contract to contract, usually for a modest flat fee, with no share of royalties. Publishers, not translators, initiate most translations, and publishers generally seek to minimize translation costs. Publishers are also very often reluctant to grant translators copyright in their translations. This is not just unfair. Venuti argues it is a form of cultural and economic repression. The translator produces the very text that makes a foreign work accessible to a new readership, but they are denied recognition and financial reward. Editors and the domesticating effect. Facet describes the complex network of power around translation as a power play, with the final product considerably shaped by editors and copy editors. Often the editor working on a translation is not fluent in the source language. Their primary concern is that the translation read well in the target language. This structural constraint almost inevitably pushes translations toward domestication. If an editor can't read the original, they can only judge the target text by whether it sounds natural in English or French or German, etc. The case of Milan Kundera. A famous example of power conflict in translation comes from Milan Kundera's The Joke. The first English translator and editor working together decided to rearrange the novels intentionally, distorted chronology in order to make the story clearer for readers. Kundera, a famous and powerful author, was outraged and used his position to demand a completely new translation. This is an extreme case where the author had enough power to intervene. Most authors and virtually all translators do not have this power. The 2 to 4% problem. One of Venuti's most damning statistics. In the UK and USA, only 2 to 4% of all books published are translations from other languages. In contrast, in many other countries, France, Germany, Italy, and Netherlands, the figure is much higher, and a large proportion of these translations are from English. This asymmetry reveals a profound imbalance of cultural power. Anglo-American publishing exports its culture aggressively while remaining nearly close to foreign literature. Venuti characterizes this as producing readers who are aggressively monolingual and culturally parochial.
Slide 10. The study of how translations are received draws on reception theory, particularly the work of Hans Robert Jass, which examines how readers encounter texts with certain pre-existing expectations, what Jass calls the horizon of expectation. This horizon is shaped by everything a reader already knows about a genre, an author, and culture, or a text type. When a translation confirms to that horizon, it is received positively. When it challenges or disappoints it may be rejected. Genet's paratext. Gerald Genet's concept of paratext refers to all the textual and visual elements that surround a book and shape how it is read. Genet distinguishes between paratext and epitext. Paratext is elements that appear within the same physical object as the text: titles, subtitles, prefaces, dedication, epilogues, the cover, the blurb. These are typically controlled by the author and or publisher. The epitext elements that circulate outside the book itself: reviews in newspapers and journals, marketing material, interviews with the author, academic criticism, correspondence. These shape the reception of the text in wider culture. Paratexts are, in Genet's terms, subordinate to the text, but they are crucial in guiding how it is read and received. A reader who encounters a negative review before reading a book approaches it with very different expectations than one who reads a glowing one. This slide draws together the 6 main threads of the chapter. Invisibility. Anglo-American culture systematically makes translators invisible through a preference for fluent, domesticating translations. Publishers, editors, and reviewers all contribute to this process. The translator's labor, creativity, and cultural mediation are erased behind a smooth textual surface. Venuti advocates foreignizing strategies as a form of ethical and political resistance to this cultural hegemony. Domesticating a translation is not just an aesthetic choice. It is an ethical and political one, with real consequences for how cultures understand or fail to understand one another. Berman's 12 deforming tendencies provide a detailed diagnostic tool for understanding how translation systematically erases the foreign voice, from rationalization and clarification to the destruction of rhythms and the effacement of superimposed languages. These tendencies reveal the deep structural pressures that push translations toward domestication. Sociology. Bourdieu's concepts. field, habitus, capital, and illusion give us a powerful framework for understanding the structural forces that shape translators' position and choice. Translators occupy a weak position in the field of cultural production, with little economic capital, limited symbolic recognition, and a habitus often characterized by internalized submission to dominant norms. Power. The power network of a translation industry. Publishers, editors, literary agents, marketing teams, and reviewers largely controls translation culture. This network favors commercially viable domesticated translations and works against translator visibility and autonomy. The 2 to 4% translation rate in Anglo-American publishing is a stark indicator of this cultural insularity. Reception. Paratext and reviews reveal how translations are culturally appropriated and how translators remain invisible. Reception theory and the analysis of paratexts and epitexts show how the framing of a translated work, long before a reader opens the book, shapes how it is read and interpreted. And that's it. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like the video.